Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this panel session. My name's Abby Gilmore, and I'm at the University of Manchester. Oh, there we go, microphones. Can you hear me okay in the back? Great. You'll see there's a number of screens around the room, and we should all have access to some kind of microphone, but please do let us know if you can't see or hear. I'm really excited to be chairing and introducing this panel today. I'm part of a new Arts and Humanities Research Council initiative called the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre, and I'm also part of Creative Manchester, which is a new initiative by the University of Manchester, led by the School of Arts. And what this initiative hopes to do is to connect up the dots between arts, humanities, and sciences, social and antisocial. And so I'm really excited to chair this panel because I think it's something that really does that. First, a couple of words about creative industries. In the Greater Manchester Local Industrial Strategy, which was published this week, I'm sure you've all read it already, creative industries factored rather highly. They're seen to be a strategic driver. They're significant alongside other sectors that are undertaking development, like clean growth, health, innovation, advanced materials and manufacturing. And they're being heralded for what they can potentially do for the people and places of Manchester in terms of job creation, in terms of tourism, well-being, quality of life, and also in terms of creating innovation and ideas. And this is partly, they've also been sort of featured in the National Industrial Strategy, and there's investment targeted into research, which is hoping to discover and investigate various aspects of the creative development of things like digital and immersive technologies, which we'll be talking about today, but also thinking about evidence for policy making for sector growth. So this panel's members have all got connections to these agendas, as you'll hear, and through their research and their leadership in a variety of different disciplines across the arts, humanities and sciences. I'm delighted to introduce, going right to left, Marsha Corneyer from MMU, Joe Lindley from Lancaster University, Jess Simons from the University of Manchester and also from her own company Digital Lab, and Farida Viz also from MMU. And as you'll hopefully have seen, the theme of the panel is about creative visions. It's asking the questions about how and can digital help humanity in helping us see more clearly, and what happens when we entrust machines and digital and immersive technologies with our senses, with our ears and eyes. So I'm going to chair each speaker quite tightly so that they all have a chance to tell you about their work. And then there'll be time for questions and a bit of a discussion later. Okay, so first up, Marsha, over to the hotspot.
Hello, everyone. As you can tell, I'm not from here. I'm from Canada. So I just moved to Manchester about 6 months ago. So thank you very much to everybody for welcoming me here and having me. And so far, I'm having a great time here in the UK. Just a little bit about me. I'm a writer with a traditional film background. So I did indie film, web series, that kind of thing. But always felt that film as a medium was too fixed. So that's why I kind of came to immersive media, because it allows more interaction from the audience and less, it just stays alive longer. I'm also an open licensing specialist, so I have an interest in copyright law reform. I just went to the Creative Commons Global Summit in Lisbon, where I did a workshop on collective authorship and how we can use open licensing to kind of circumvent the ways that copyright law makes it really difficult to make money collectively. So I really believe in the potential of the internet to create kind of commercial opportunities for people working in the same story worlds. That's my interest. I work at MMU right now as a research associate, so I'm working on a project called Audience with a Hero. It's the Forever Project, Bright White Limited and MMU together, and it's funded by the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. And where the AI kind of creative vision comes in with that is we're trying to make an immersive encounter between a hero and the audience members. So we're using a mixture of video, kind of depth video, real-time graphics, and natural language processing. So using AI as a container for a conversation that feels natural between an audience member and a hero in virtual reality where you'll just get to speak with them. So we're trying to make it as real and as seamless as possible. It's a long way off and it's very experimental, which I think is another great thing about these industries. So it's a Q&A interface, essentially. And the Forever Project did it most recently with Holocaust survivors, so that allowed school children to ask direct questions to Holocaust survivors and get a kind of more interactive educational experience rather than just watching kind of static video. And as far as the seeing through digital eyes, when I was thinking about this today, I was thinking about how it maintains a kind of hierarchy that we have of our senses, where we place vision at the very top and everything else kind of comes after. And I feel like it might be more helpful not to think of it just as vision, but kind of creative senses or seeing through digital senses. So instead of asking, what does smoke look like to a smoke detector, it'd be like, what does smoke taste like to a smoke detector? Might be an interesting way to think about it. And one thing that I find interesting about recreating kind of sensory information in a virtual space is that it's recognizing that realism is a construct, that it takes just as much coding to create real reality and physics in a virtual space as it does to create anything else. And it changes our perceptual mechanisms like sight and sound and sensation into a computational interaction that we can experiment with. And here I think in naivety is kind of an asset because it allows us to reorient ourselves around the perceptual mechanisms that we've come to kind of take for granted as natural. So the less we notice our own perceptual mechanisms in real life, we have an opportunity now in virtual space to experience them deliberately, to experience sight deliberately and our senses deliberately, because we have this kind of alienating interface of the headset or any other kind of digital interfaces. And I'll just show you a small bit of a project I did last year. So this is Undercroft. It was a 360.
You should start with another click.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, it's an animation, so you can see it's kind of moving there. So Undercroft was a 360-degree experience that aimed to embody its own science fiction concept. So it was a 3-minute transmedia experience of layered perspectives. I shot it at some caves in Canada. It's pretty dark. That one you can see a little better? No. Well, anyway, so there were some caves in Canada, and it was a transmedia experience. Just a little bit about the story. So the story of this kind of science fiction world is that an archaeologist found dinosaur bones that were impossibly young and realized that it was because there was a bacteria surrounding them that slowed down the process of time and decay. So it became the most valuable natural resource on Earth, and no one knows how to find more of it because it has pharmaceutical applications, cosmetic applications, as something that slows down time. So I wanted to use this 360 experience to kind of play with the perception of time a little bit. So the way that you hear sound changes based on what you see. And you can see that the bacteria kind of on there. No, sorry, it's a little dark. But it was an experiment in these kind of recreating perceptual mechanisms in 360 degrees. So it was a narrative entry point to a larger story world. It kind of nested into a novella of the same title. So it had different perspectives layered on top of each other. So you have the kind of natural perspective of the bacteria in the cave itself. You are actually seeing and experiencing what it was like to first discover this stuff. And the voiceover was someone describing it in a way that was a lot more kind of congenial than it actually was. So, I mean, I guess that's everything. I'd like to leave you with a little bit of a quote from phenomenology, which I think is a genre of, or a discipline that we can take a lot from right now. So this is from George Santayana, The Sense of Beauty. He said, "Now we only ask for reasons when we are surprised. If we had no expectations, we should have no surprises. And what gives us expectation is the spontaneous direction of our thought, determined by the structure of our brain and the effects of our experience. If our spontaneous thoughts came to run in harmony with the course of nature, if our expectations were then continually fulfilled, the sense of mystery would vanish."
Thank you. Okay, so we'll take questions later at the end if that's all right. But if I could just swap you two over, and next we'll hear from Joe about.
Thank you.
about work that you're doing as part of your current research.
Great, I'll crack on. Now, I didn't make any sort of presentation when I arrived. Someone said, "Where's your presentation?" So I provided this GIF, which I happen to have created this morning, which in some way will link back to what I'm going to talk about. Also, usually I flail my arms around madly when I'm talking, but I can't because of this microphone. So if I start steaming out of my ears, that's probably what's going on. So I think I'll start sort of to be vaguely provocative and talk to the questions that the session was asking about seeing through digital eyes and so on, and sort of the impact of AI on how we see the world and how we create in the world. I mean, I'd say that how we see through digital eyes is just how we see. It's happened. We're already living surrounded by AI completely. It affects everything from the route you might take to work, what products you see incidentally when you search for something else online. It affects the words you use when you're texting your mate. You know, that's an AI system that goes on in there and suggests what you might say. Right through to, I use Photoshop all the time, and a lot of the tools in there are built using big data, analysed using an AI to help me quickly select the white bit and separate it from the black bit. So this stuff is around us everywhere. It's already happened. So that's a starting point. I've referred to this as a kind of grey mirror before in reference to the Black Mirror series, which looks at dystopian futures. Now, I kind of think we're already halfway there with a lot of those things, but it's actually grey, because there's lots of benefits to it too. You know, the Photoshop tool makes it a damn sight easier to do stuff. So that's my kind of, my starting point. Now, a bit of background information. I work at Imagination Lancaster, which is a design-led research lab. To quickly qualify what that is, because I'm championing design research at the moment. It's not researching how to do design, it's using designerly methods to try and research other stuff. And that's particularly useful when trying to understand technology and what's going on in the world, because designers always have been integrators. They look at a problem, they look at the available tools, they look at who might want the solution and bring these things together. And that's what we do in the lab. So as opposed to being a proper scientist, working in that scientific idiom, or being a proper artist, being completely expressive, we're somewhere in the middle. And with the challenges that technology gives us, it's kind of a new reality. It's a particularly apt set of tools to make sense of that new reality. While I'm on the subject of imagination, by the way, news was announced yesterday. We just got a massive grant and are about to double in size. So if you're interested in any of this, we've got 10 lecturer positions, 10 researcher positions, and 10 PhD positions. Look it up. How long have I got left?
3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay. So I should probably explain that at some point. I should also explain CEIF, which is the project that's employing me at the moment. Now, on CEIF, we have explored using AI and connected technologies to deliver an immersive experience, but specifically not AI. We refer to VR, sorry, not AI. We refer to VR as a liminal experience, so it transports you away from where you are and puts you in a completely different world. What we're trying to create is a liminoid experience, so you're very much in the room, and we've created a living room that you sit in, but it's augmented by a load of smart technology. And that might be anything from a fan blowing in your face when there's an outdoor scene on the screen, to sensors picking up your mood and affecting the narrative. But all of this stuff is meant to disappear into the background. So that's a project I've been doing that we call the living room of the future, and maybe it'll come up in our discussion later. This is an example of the kind of design research I've been talking about, or it's a little clip from it. To try and understand how we should feel about AI and connected objects and the impact that they're having, that, as I said, has already kind of happened in many ways, we need new ways to think about it, because all of the old kind of philosophies and phenomenology and ontology, it's all thousands of years old, and in the last 30 years, we've completely changed the fabric of the world. So started by playing with this really weird theory called object-oriented ontology, which is a philosophical approach to try and understand what it might be like to be a thing. So a glass, or a router, or a little robot. Now, it's a really fun theory, but it's completely bonkers and inaccessible. It basically says, there's no way I can ever understand what it's like to be that robot. And for me, that kind of kills it off dead. There's not a lot you can do with that. So we combined it with a more sort of out there idea of animism, which kind of comes from Shinto, and it's the idea that everything's got a spirit. So this project is trying to mix a little bit of that philosophy with a little bit of animism to hopefully come up with some kind of tool that, with a bit more work, someone might be able to use to make sense of this new reality that I'm talking about. Now, that's a clip from a film I was working on yesterday, and it's essentially a whodunit. There's a load of objects in a house. There's a robot, a router. The thing on the left is called PetCube and is a dog treat dispensing webcam. God, I should log on to it. I think it's not plugged in. It's in my house. But, it's really weird. And Lydia, who's in the room, has been freaked out a few times when I connect to it from outside the house, suddenly start talking to her, and then fling, I don't have a dog, so there's Skittles in it instead. So we have PetCube, we have the router, we have the robot, there's various lights, a Google Home device. These objects, informed by the object-oriented ontology and animism, wrapped up in a design research methodology. I tell a story about them, and the idea is that we'll come up with a new way to look at this stuff and hopefully make sense of it and teach and use to make laws and ethical judgments and so on. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joe. And if you could pass the mic on to Jess, who may or may not perform a mic drop.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. So I'm Jessica Simons. I started out in life as a digital consultant 25 years ago, and then I started setting up social enterprises and creative enterprises in reaction to what I saw as the capitalist machine that was destroying everything. And then I decided to do a PhD to try and understand how to change things. And my theory was that if you understand how decisions are made, and then how ideas come to be realized, then you might have a better way of thinking, where are the levers, what are the processes that actually are influenceable. And in that journey, I ended up looking at the creative industries, and I worked with Abby to go out to Cheshire and find out how to connect rural areas to the creative economy. And while I was there, I came across immersive tech, the immersive sector, which is virtual and augmented reality. And I found that this is truly transformative, and it's something that we need to be careful about. And one of my things that I came to understand was that you need to be in it to change it. So I've left the university sector to set up a business. And my business is Visioning Lab, and my first product is a pop-up digital art gallery. And you'll find out why I see that as being instrumental in influencing how this sector evolves. So the concept for the pop-up digital art gallery is the art is all around you, but you need a device to see it. It uses augmented reality. You put an image out, you open up an app on your phone, you hover your phone over the image, and it pops up a piece of art. So my go-to concept is Pokemon Go, but for art. But what is these immersive experiences? Now, people talk about headsets usually, and handsets and different kinds of technologies, but really where this is going, and the people in the sector, the way that they're talking, is that we have our physical world, and then we have our digital world, and it's all around us. And we have that already, it's obvious. We have all sorts of things moving through the air, the waves of the different machines that we're using, the way we communicate, Wi-Fi, But actually, this is more about, people remember Jessica Rabbit? Yeah? So imagine that there's cartoon characters sitting on the chairs alongside us. Yeah, that's the kind of vision that people are working with. How can you bring the digital realm so that it imbues our life in every way? This here is a Magic Leap, which is a set of glasses which effectively models what the phone does, but in front of your eyes. So like Google Glass, you have a pair of glasses on, you can see the world, but you can also see a digital layer in 3D. So this is the app that I've created, and the concept that I'm working with here, again, is that it's coming out of the computer. Yeah? It's escaping. And why I think this is important is because this is a photograph by Snowden of David Hockney. And you can see that he was making work in what is a 2D plane. Yeah? He's drawing, he's painting on paper or on canvas. And what I found when I was doing research in how to connect different communities to the creative economy was that people would remember their experiences of doing art as a child and their ability to render a copy of the world around them onto a 2D plane affected their perceptions of themselves as being creative. Yeah, so they would say to me, I can't draw, meaning I can't draw a copy of this chair or that tree or that person, therefore I'm not creative. Yeah, and that really troubled me, that there's this perspective, and I don't know if it's a British thing, my research has only been in the UK, but that really troubled me, that people were constrained by their sense of themselves as creative because of something that happened when they were 10 at school. And some people reacted against that and said, well, I might not be able to draw, but I'm still creative, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. So it's not like the whole world closed down because they couldn't draw on a piece of paper. But there is a large proportion of people who understand themselves as not being creative because they can't draw a copy of the 3D world on a 2D plane. So what I think is really interesting about VR is that you can draw a 3D object in 3D. So it's taking away the need to understand perspective, vanishing point. When you ask someone, you put a headset on them and you ask them to draw in 3D, and this is a guy here who's drawing, what they do is they draw an actual object, yeah, as it is in the real world. And so I took a VR headset around libraries in Cheshire, and people came in, they said the usual things, I can't draw, I'm not creative. I put a headset on them, and I say, right, draw a cube. And they go, oh, I don't know. So they draw in that way that we're taught at school. They draw a square like that, then they draw a line coming out of it. Yeah? And they draw what looks like a cube and say, okay, we'll walk around it. So they walk around, and it's flat. It's like, now draw an actual cube, and we've got a great demonstration here in front of us. So when they draw a square like that, and then a line coming out like that, and another one coming out like that. And what you find is that pretty much everyone can draw in 3D if they're drawing in VR. And here's one that my son created. It took him about, 30 seconds to draw something which other people find really challenging to do in a 2D environment. So that then draws the question, if people are no longer making that connection between not being able to draw in a 2D plane and therefore not seeing themselves as creative, if they can draw, if they're raised to think of themselves as being able to render accurate copies of the 3D world, then that connection between being creative and not is broken. And what does that mean? So returning to my pop-up digital art gallery, the question that I'm asking myself as I develop this business is, how can I get people to make? Who do I get to make in 3D? And are there people out there who perceive themselves as not being creative, not being able to draw, who actually could make magnificent art in this setting? And so that's what my agenda is. Thank you.
Thank you, Jess. And if you could pass the mic on to, last but not least, Farida.
Am I okay not to sit on the...
You don't have to
Is
sit.
that...
You can.
All right, you look worried. Is that okay? So I'm here representing Ray Drainville, who is a postdoc in the Visual Social Media Lab that I direct. So he's here with us in spirit and also in picture. And that's me when I was a bit younger. So Ray is a Steve Fellow. I'm his mentor. And the project that he's exploring, and what we're exploring together, is can AI recognize the ways in which text and image reinforce one another? So this is a kind of typical, vague, what the hell does it mean, academic kind of question. So what we're interested in is how the text surrounding an image could potentially help the AI better understand what is in the image, which means in order to start to unpack how it does something is we need to understand how does it recognize images and what does it do with text and how could you potentially put those together and what happens then. So it's quite abstract, but what we are focusing on at the moment is really the image side. This is where we're doing quite some work. So Ray has a very useful and interesting background to do this. So he has a kind of an art historical background, but also a technology and web design background. And he's just completed a PhD that looked at a very large data set of images of the dead 3-year-old Alan Kurdi, the refugee boy who washed up in Turkey in 2015, and did a kind of manual analysis of a large data set. And so where we're kind of jumping off from there is what would AI be able to do with a large data set? And one of the things that was a starting point for this is an image that Ray has done some analysis on coming out of the Black Lives Matter movement in the US from 2016. So this is a protester, Aisha Evans, who in the software that we use in the Visual Social Media Lab, this image was recognized as a wedding, right? So sometimes when you're doing research on technology, things become very clear to you all of a sudden when something is misrecognized, right? When something doesn't work. And when it doesn't work, kind of, it almost really shows in a very clear way how something does work. So what we wanted to understand is how is it that this image, analyzed through the software that we use in the lab, Pulsar, which is underpinned by Clarify, which is one of the kind of standard AI technologies that people use for identifying content in images, that software tends to be deployed in commercial contexts. So it's been trained on things like fashion, food, travel. And what you end up with then is to try and understand what happened, you have to understand what did the AI see, right? So if you look at the image, you could imagine that it was trying to identify some similarities to other kinds of images it had seen based on these categories. One of those categories it may have been trained on, right? So you have an image where you have maybe a kind of a stiff pose, where you have a woman who is the center of attention, you have a kind of captive audience, you have a flowing dress, and she may be holding something, right? Hey presto, the AI recognizes it as a wedding. Because when you have a machine trained on wedding images, other images it is then introduced to, it just wants to see a wedding, right? And so what was interesting when we looked at that image through the lens of that kind of domain expertise of that AI, that's what it saw, and that's what was of interest to us. So as I said, we're focusing very much on the image part of this question. So why do we care? And many of the panel members so far have already highlighted, this is all around us. So one of the things that we're specifically interested in is some of the kind of social justice, criminology type implications. So one of the things in terms of facial recognition, police departments and governments around the world are very fond of trying to roll this stuff out. So there's an example from the US that the ACLU in America's civil rights organization has looked at, where they looked at Amazon's facial recognition software and found that if you combine images of members of Congress who are people of color in this case, so they purposely wanted to find how are people of color identified by the software if you match this, if you combine this with a large database of mugshots. And what you found is, of course, it found many matches of these members of Congress being criminals. In fact, 20% of these Congress members were matched as a criminal, and in a kind of a wider population of people of color, it's as high as 40%. So when you have governments deploying this stuff, and there are a number of different examples, this is the stuff that we're very interested in. Like, what are the concerns here? There's other real-world examples. For example, self-driving cars running on AI. What happens if there's an obstruction in the road, or what happens if there's reflective tape on the road and it cannot see? Right? So there's a number of examples. Deepfake videos is another one where AI is being used, and people are very concerned about this. So the key concern that we're interested in is, how can we understand and trust machine learning, specifically in the context of academic research? So I just want to give an example of this for wrapping up. So the way in which machine learning is normally trained is you have a very large data set that people have to manually annotate. So people have to say, yes, these are pictures of hot dogs, right? But the way in which that is being done is through glancing at images at very, very rapid speed, to be able to say in around 250 milliseconds, yes, I recognize a hot dog, right? So it's also worth understanding, how are these data sets annotated, and how do people come to understand these examples? And also, how are these data sets then tricked? So this is a really interesting example of an app that purports to identify hot dogs, and when it's been loaded with images that the human eye can see as clearly not hot dogs, it is still saying ding, 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 these are all hot dogs, right? So it's also trying to understand, how do these things work when you start to unpack them? How are they biased? In this case, this is a one called YOLO. It is biased in wanting to recognize camels as horses, right? So again, the human eye can clearly see a camel there, and it's recognizing it as a horse. There's many examples of misrecognition, over-recognition, and under-recognition or identification. So things that are being misrecognized, so the wrongful recognition of beds, the over identification of too many people when there aren't people, or under-recognizing when there's more people than it's being able to recognize, complete misrecognition, so these are not wine glasses, or the misrecognition of a gun for a cell phone. So there's also an issue with this kind of labeling, which happens, as I said, very, very rapidly when people, for example, on Amazon Mechanical Turk, only have a split second to very quickly recognize something, so they glance, so this idea of a photographic glance. And what you have is, this is a Facebook example of an original photograph, and these different stages of how this technology is currently developing, where in a much earlier stage, so this is AlexNet from 2012, we were only able to see people and trees, to where Facebook is now using the somewhat sinister name named Facebook Panoptic FPN, where it is able to recognize a lot more, and it can recognize instances and location and surrounding context, but it's still not able to recognize specific people or to say more than person, and also not buildings. So what we are really interested in terms of the wider kind of discussions as part of this panel, is, what are the consequences for this in terms of academic research? When this stuff starts to get rolled out and people are starting to use this stuff in academic research, what are the consequences of people not fully understanding how these problems slip in, and how people can trust, in a way, what the AI is interpreting for them visually, and what are the concerns that we may have to really take on board when it comes to that. So this is some of the work that we're currently doing with the Visual Social Media Lab, and also internationally. We've just got a new network with NYU and UCLA. So thank you.
Okay, so thank you to all our panellists. It's time to shuffle our chairs, folks. I'd like to open it up to the floor and see if anyone has any questions or comments for the panellists. And if not, I'll encourage them to ask each other questions.
Yeah, I'll ask the audience question. So, of the things that I was saying around people perceiving themselves as being creative or not creative because they can't draw accurate versions of the world around them on a piece of paper, how many people would agree that that affected their feeling of whether or not they were creative? Okay, thank you.
I think so. I have a small child who's nearly 2 now, who goes to a nursery, which is Reggio Emilia. So the idea of 100 languages and art being a very, very key component. So I was very struck by what you said, because with her, her creative expression is limitless. So we put no boundaries on it whatsoever. They have a resident artist who work with the kids as well. And what I'm seeing, and it's really interesting for people who have kids, when I compare how she expresses herself versus some of her friends who are really trying to draw inside the line, there's already this kind of framework of rules that is being applied and internalized. And with her, we've really tried to not have that at all. So she just does whatever she wants. I mean, she did a very large canvas painting the other day, which she did with her bum. So she dipped her bum in paint and then sort of scooted across the paper. And it's really interesting that if you just say, that's great, you encourage something completely different. So I think it's very, very interesting. And I wonder if you also do more work with, like that very, very young age group to see how early that stuff starts.
Can I pick up on that? Because I think that's interesting in that I found that you were talking about your interventions potentially democratizing creativity to a certain degree and taking down barriers. And I think it also connected up what, for me, connected across all of the talks was your comment about naivety being an asset and about finding out how to kind of take away the rules or how to have more experimentation. Are there any downsides to that, do you think, from the different kinds of work you're doing?
Well, so it's the education system really affects this. So, you as a parent, you allow your child to do something and then they go into a school education environment. And I'm not criticising art teachers because they're required to teach in a particular way. It's the whole system, really. And what's coming with the digital, which is really exciting, is that it's changing everything. And when the tools of making and using digital tools like VR to draw come into school environments, it will change how people make. And so it will change their perspectives. And it's whether or not we do it consciously. So we know, oh yes, this is going to affect people's perceptions of creativity. Creativity is talked about a lot, but it's still quite an emic term. People still just use it, and they have their definition of it. So yeah, that's.
I think that there's a danger there to assume that everything is completely new. In that we kind of have a cultural amnesia about the craft of classical art practices, and that there's a lot that we can learn from sculpture, for example, the stuff that Keith Brown is doing that Jess Simons has in her pop-up gallery. His sculpture is just breathtaking, and he's a classically trained sculptor, and coming from filmmaking, I kind of just missed the comfort of a traditional craft, and just knowing what the hierarchy is, and knowing, you're on set, you have the frame, and the frame is all you have to worry about. And now there's so much more, and it's about trying to import the kind of craft and attitude and practice from more traditional art genres without just importing cinema directly to 360 video, which is a mistake I think that some people are making in terms of how do we get people to look at exactly what we want them to look at. And it's not the same thing. So I think it's a mix, and that there is the danger of assuming that everything is brand new and that we have to discover everything as it comes up, but that there's a lot in traditional art practice and especially craft that we can take over.
Yeah, I'm not worried at all. There's the technology that's new is just another tool, and artists, including very small children, I think it's probably a tacit thing, the creativity. They just experiment and mess around with whatever they've got in front of them, and if they've got a new set of digital tools, they'll make something new and different. I don't think there's too much of a concern there. And Marshall McLuhan, who's one of my favourite sort of vaguely academic thinkers, partly because he just made stuff up. He didn't try to research it properly. He just said things, and it was quite compelling. One of those things he said was about the future and about technology. At the time, it was all television mainly. Was we march backwards into the future, and we look at the present in the rearview mirror. And I think we're kind of at that phase with all this stuff. We're really worried about it, and actually, most of it's happened, and we'll realise in a few years' time, and it'll probably be fine.
This worrying. So one of the things that I meant to emphasise was I had the old order and the new order, and there's lots of hierarchies in the art world which I think are being broken down at the moment, and particularly around how one acknowledges an artwork, what one thinks counts as an artwork. And there's some really lovely making that's going on in the VR community, which you can follow on Twitter, and people are sort of making work and sharing work, and it feels very fluid. And people are adopting each other's practices, and so there's not that, as you say, Marsha, of course it happens all the time in lots of different art practices, but maybe it's just that it's more visible because it's digital. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question from the floor.
Sorry, I hope this is a coherent question. So this is around the use of facial recognition technologies and the like. Obviously, a problem that we have right now is the fact that a lot of these things are quite inaccurate, culturally biased, and that poses one set of problems. Will it be better or worse when or if somebody actually fixes these problems, if they become 100% accurate? Is that actually good, or is this something that we want to get rid of entirely? Okay.
So that kind of creative mistakes, in some ways, can be useful. What happens if it's 100% accurate?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting way of looking at it, because one of the things that you could say, and I agree with you, one of the ways in which you interpret maybe the accuracy level of this kind of facial recognition used by police departments. So the example that I had up is 96% accurate London Met, which you think, okay, that's actually a really big margin of error, 4%. So in 4% of cases, they get it really wrong, or, the examples that I gave for the mugshots. And so the examples often are around people of color who are misrecognized for all sorts of different reasons, to do with training data and so on. So recently I read a piece, and I can't remember where I saw that, that said, well, maybe that's a good thing, actually. Maybe it's positive, and we should kind of spin that narrative to suggest we shouldn't try and improve it, because what are you improving, for what reason, and what are the impacts of that? So if we see some of these technologies as an extension of already biased and problematic systems of, justice and so on, then what are the consequences of this working at 100%? I don't know. I think your suggestion, it just shouldn't be used whatsoever, reminds me of a comment that someone who we're working with as part of this network, Sophia Noble, has said that issues around AI will be one of the kind of human rights issues for the 21st century. And I don't think she's wrong there. So I don't see a kind of, we don't have anything to worry about kind of future. I think if you're looking at these kind of issues that we're interested in, I feel that I see a lot that there is to worry about. And the thing that worries me a great deal is that it does feel like we're in a situation now where the horse is kind of already bolted. And how do you claw that back? Because the technology is not slowing down. The legislation can't keep up with it. And I think we really don't have a grip at all yet on the consequences. And I think they're far grimmer than we're currently imagining for the aspects that I've highlighted. I mean, I think the creative side is very positive, but I think that there is this other downside that comes with the improvements in the technology that I think we need to take really, really seriously.
Okay, thank you. And we have time for one last question or comment so that perhaps we can end on a note where the sun is coming out. I mean, I think there has been a theme running through about, how can we use these new knowledges around technological practices and skills to avoid dystopia. Anyone got a comment or a question that helps with that mission from the panel? Joe.
So I agree with a lot of what you're saying, and I think it is the human rights issue of the 21st century is your relationship with data and what that means. But I think we need to be pragmatic as well. And the horse has bolted. It's already surrounding us. There's something particularly creepy about a computer making a prejudicial judgment, which then affects you in a very real way, getting let into a country or getting a bank account or not. But on the pragmatic note, that's been happening forever. We are prejudiced, and the reason the AIs are prejudiced is that we've made them in our own image. We've created them. They're made by people, and they're based on data which we've created, which describes the biased world that we live in. But it's got many beautiful things in it as well, and the sun's coming out. And there's loads of benefits too. I mean, I accept the creepiness, and we have to take it seriously. But the amazing benefits for healthcare outcomes, and even at the Big Brother end of the spectrum, Singapore is a crazy surveillance state. They scan everyone's face when they arrive there, but that has demonstrably prevented various terrorist attacks. So there's an extreme example, but it's possible that there's plus sides, but we do need to take it seriously.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's showing us to ourselves, very clearly. So maybe it would make us sort ourselves out.
That's interesting. The project that Joe and Ray, your research fellow, is working on is called Augmented Humanities, but actually it's not augmenting, has it? It's revealing humanities. So,
and I would say one of the things that I think is really important in all of that is how can people opt out of that?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Marsha, any last comments from you?
I just have a follow-up question for Farida, just because just reading about the kind of spoofing that goes on with AI and how much people say that it's AI responsible for making these decisions, and you pull back the curtain and it's actually a bunch of people doing that. What has your experience been with subjects of racial bias and AI and the amount of spoofing that goes on?
So I think that's a really good point. So one of the things that there is this kind of narrative around what can AI do, which is, I think, quite overinflated in terms of what it's actually capable of. So you're absolutely right that a lot, when you kind of pull back the curtain, a lot of it is people doing stuff at breakneck speed, trying to, respond in chatbots or trying to recognize images and so on and so forth. I haven't found any examples in terms of the space that we're looking at, but I'm sure there are, and I think that's a really good point to also think about how are people. I think what I would be very interested in is how are people subverting the AI, knowing how you can kind of use the tools against itself. So I think that's an interesting way around kind of looking, and maybe also is a way of thinking about opting out or speaking back, or what are the kind of strategies that you can adopt or think about if you feel uncomfortable about these things. And I think so there's also a kind of an educational piece, a literacy piece that I think we haven't really talked about. How can you encourage citizens, kids, whatever, to start thinking about not wanting to be recognized or spoofing, or what strategies can you deploy? I think that's a really valuable and interesting and also very creative way of thinking about it.
Okay, thank you. I think I'm happy that we left on a naive but also informed and optimistic note there. So literacy to deal with some of the issues we've been raised. I'd like us to thank the very interesting, I think, panel, and also thank you for your attention. And I hope you have a good rest of your Microdot. Thank you.